The winter wind, off the sea, crawled up the cliffs and into every seam of Santina Milano's uniform. It slipped under the thin black fabric, found the dampness at the base of her neck, and settled there like a layer of ice that refused to melt. Outside, the sky was a flat sheet of dark water and clouds. Inside Romeo Barry's estate, the world glowed gold. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's go back to hours before, where it all started. Light from chandeliers poured over polished wood, silk drapes, and glittering crystal. The air in the grand dining room was thick with roasted garlic, truffle oil, and old wine, heavy enough that it felt like something you could choke on if you stood still too long. Conversation drifted up from a long table in low, practiced tones. Laughter rose and fell in careful bursts, never quite reaching the walls where the guards stood. Santina moved through the room with a silver tray balanced on one hand. Her feet burned inside stiff shoes. Her shoulders ached from a day spent hauling laundry, scrubbing stone steps, and polishing every surface until it reflected the candlelight back at her. The muscles in her lower back pulsed with a dull, steady pain, but she kept her smile small and polite, the way the housekeeper liked it. She had been working since before sunrise. She would not be finished until the last glass was washed and stacked. She could not afford to be tired. Every coin she earned here traveled back across the sea into the hands of a woman who still wheezed when she climbed 3 steps. Her mother's medicine bill sat in Santina's mind like a weight she could not put down. One careless mistake, one broken glass near the wrong guest, and Romeo Barries could decide that someone else deserved this job. Someone who did not send half her wages home each month. The dining room shimmered with different lives. Men in dark suits leaned back in their chairs, jackets open, the shine of their watches catching the light as they murmured about ports and shipments. Wives and girlfriends in red lipstick and high heels ran fingers along delicate stems of glasses, laughing a fraction too loud at jokes that were not funny. A black driver in a crisp shirt stood just inside the doorway, waiting for a signal, eyes never leaving his employer's shoulders. Servants moved around the edges like a tide, placing dishes, refilling wine, vanishing at the first hint of impatience. Santina slid through all of it. Her tray did not tremble. Her steps were silent over the rugs. She knew exactly how close she could stand without making a guest feel crowded, exactly how long she could hold someone's gaze before they decided she was staring. She had taught herself to appear only when there was a need, then disappear so quickly that people forgot she had ever been there. That invisibility kept her alive. It was also the reason she noticed him, always, before anyone had time to say his name. Romeo Barries sat at the head of a long, dark table, shoulders square, the sleeves of his black suit pulled back just enough to show ink curling along his wrists. A maroon shirt lay open at the collar, framing a thick gold chain against his chest. His skin was pale beneath the warm light, but his eyes were cold and steady, moving from guest to guest with the slow patience of someone used to being obeyed long before he had to speak. Around him, for guards in black shirts kept their arms folded, backs to the walls, faces expressionless. They did not drink. They did not joke. They were there to be the line between Romeo and everything that wanted a piece of him. Everyone in the house knew his rules. No shouting across the room. No phones at the table. No whispering within earshot of his chair, unless you had something you were ready to die for. Mistakes were not met with raised voices. They were met with shifts taken away, doors that did not open again, uniforms quietly collected from lockers. Santina had seen men arrive at the estate with rough hands and hard eyes, had watched them leave weeks later in tailored suits and new cars. She had also seen a chef disappear after a broken plate landed too close to a visiting lieutenant. His name was not spoken again. She had learned not to ask questions about Romeo Barries. Families like his did not exist on official paperwork. They existed in rumors, in the way police cars slowed at the bottom of the hill and then kept moving. Only fools tried to trace the lines of power that ran through this house. Across from Romeo, Amelia Lettier stood in a gown the color of deep wine, fabric wrapped tight around her waist before flowing down in a long slit over one leg. Diamonds rested at her throat and along her ears. Her blonde hair was twisted into a perfect knot at the back of her head, not a strand out of place. She thanked the staff for each dish with a gentle smile that never quite reached her eyes. To Santina, Amelia looked like she had stepped out of a painting. Soft voice, soft hands, soft perfume. There were stories among the servants that she had been raised in another world entirely, one of music schools and quiet gardens, before marrying into this house of guns and ledgers. When Amelia walked through the corridors, people straightened their uniforms without quite knowing why. Tonight, though, something in her was wrong. From the moment Santina carried in the first course, she felt it. The way Amelia's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass whenever Romeo lowered his gaze to the paper in his hands. The quick flick of her eyes toward the doorway where the new driver waited. The way the air around the head of the table felt heavier than usual, as if it knew it was holding its breath. Every time Santina circled the table, she felt that pressure building. She told herself it was her imagination, that she was simply exhausted, that rich people had their own strange tensions, and it was none of her business. She reminded herself of the rule that had kept her in this house for 2 full years. See everything, say nothing. Yet the words did not comfort her. They sat in her chest like a stone. If you're listening to this, and you can already feel the tension in this room, imagine standing there with a tray in your hands, knowing that one wrong word could save a life or end your own. Before we go further, take a second to support this story. Tap subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your words help us keep bringing stories like this to you from every corner of the world. The first time Santina ever saw Romeo Bariz had not been on a night like this, when danger pressed against the glass of the windows. It had been months earlier, when she was still new to the estate, when she did not yet understand how one man's silence could control an entire room. That night, the wind had been softer and the guest list shorter. Santina had walked into the dining room with a tray that shook a little in her hands, her new black uniform still stiff with starch. She kept touching the white apron to make sure it sat straight. The housekeeper had warned her 3 times that if she spilled so much as a drop near Romeo, she would be back in the village before sunrise. The house had seemed impossibly large then. Marble steps that echoed, long corridors lined with oil paintings of men who all had the same hard jaw, crystal lamps that turned ordinary dust into glitter. In the servants' quarters that first week, she had shared a narrow bed with her suitcase and listened to older maids whisper about the rules of the Bariz estate. See everything, say nothing. Never repeat what you hear in the corridors. Never ask where the blood on a shirt came from. Never stare at the guards when they come in late with swollen knuckles. There had been a girl before Santina, a maid named Leah, who liked to talk. She had joked in the laundry room that Romeo's guests drank more than they could afford and sworn she had seen one of them crying in a hallway. 2 days later, Leah was gone. The housekeeper said she had gone to the countryside to take care of her sick aunt. Her locker remained locked for weeks, then vanished without anyone seeing who emptied it. No one mentioned her name again. Santina learned fast. She kept her voice low and her eyes lower. At night, when she lay in her narrow bed, she counted shifts the way other people counted sheep. If she worked 6 nights a week and no one complained, she might cover her mother's medicine before the end of the year. That was all she wanted from the Bariz estate. Work, money, distance. Then Romeo came to dinner. She had known he was home, of course. The air changed when his car climbed the hill. Guards snapped to attention. Radios crackled more often. But he had not appeared in person during her first days. He was something people spoke around, not about. That first evening he stepped into the dining room. The sound level dropped by a fraction. He did not need to clear his throat. He simply moved to the head of the table, and the men already seated there shifted in their chairs as if the room itself had tilted. He sat, adjusted the cuffs of his black suit to reveal the edges of his tattoos, and unfolded his napkin with the same calm he probably used when signing contracts that changed lives. Santina had stood at the door for half a heartbeat too long, staring. The housekeeper nudged her hard in the side and hissed at her to move. She went from chair to chair with a pitcher of water, fingers tight around the handle, eyes on the level of each glass. When she reached Romeo, she could feel his gaze before she looked up. It was not loud or mocking. It was simply aware, as if he was measuring how easily she would break. "Thank you," he had said in a voice that was softer than she expected. She had managed a quiet signore and stepped away, heart pounding, determined never to draw that attention again. Amelia had appeared later in the meal, a little late, apologizing with a smile and a touch to Romeo's arm. Her gown that night had been pale gold, her hair swept back from her face, diamonds catching the light whenever she turned her head. She moved around the table, greeting each guest with a kiss on the cheek, her voice warm and musical. When she reached the sideboard where Santina stood, Amelia paused. Her eyes dropped to the folded napkins and the placement of the silver. One fork was slightly misaligned. "Like this," Amelia had said, adjusting it by a finger's width, then glancing at Santina. "You are new, yes?" "Yes, Signora," Santina had answered, cheeks hot. "You are fast." "That is good," Amelia replied. Her words were kind, but her gaze lingered for a moment too long, as if she were already memorizing Santina's face in case she needed to remember it later. From that night onward, Santina understood that she worked in a house where kindness came with sharp edges, where a misaligned fork could draw attention, and attention could lead to questions she did not want. Months later, with a winter sea throwing cold against the walls and the dining room blazing with light, Santina moved with far more confidence. Her tray no longer shook. She knew which guard liked his coffee strong and which guest preferred his wine refilled before it was halfway gone. She knew that Romeo's temper showed in silence, not shouting. She knew that Amelia rarely corrected anything twice. She also knew, as she crossed the corridor outside Amelia's private sitting room earlier that evening, that the voice she heard through the half-closed door was wrong. Amelia's tone, usually smooth, had stripped down to something sharp, Italian and English tangled together in a fast, clipped whisper. Santina caught only fragments. "Times," a place near the old coastal road, a phrase that made her stomach twist. "After dinner, it has to look like the street took him." The room went quiet the moment Santina's footsteps passed the door. By the time she turned her head, the handle had already clicked shut. Later, as she carried wine toward the main doors, she saw the new driver waiting outside, rain beating on the shoulders of his coat. He had been at the estate for only a week, yet he already walked past older staff as if he outranked them. His eyes did not rest on the house or the sky. They followed the line of the garage roof, the cameras, the gate. When Romeo's car left the courtyard, the driver watched his employer in the mirror more than he watched the road. Now, back in the dining room, Santina felt the memory of that whispered call and that measuring gaze pressing on her. Romeo's presence seemed to flatten the air. Amelia watched him too closely as she poured his wine, fingertips pale where they gripped the bottle. In this house, Santina thought, secrets lived longer than people. She told herself again that she would never interfere, that her job was to carry plates and count wages. Still, as the wind howled outside and the candles flickered, a chill walked up her spine that had nothing to do with the sea. The unease followed Santina into the next morning, clinging to her thoughts even as the sun crept up over the cliffs and filled the estate with its pale winter light. Dawn was always quieter here. The guards rotated shifts with low murmurs. The kitchen stirred awake with clattering pans, and the scent of fresh bread drifted into the corridors. Santina began her routine before most of the household opened their eyes. She swept the marble stairs first, starting at the top where a draft always traced along the banister. Her broom whispered over the stone, catching crumbs from the previous night's dinner and bits of mud from boots that should not have crossed the main hall. From there, she moved to the silver cabinets, unlocking them with the small key the housekeeper trusted her to carry. She polished each fork and spoon until she could see her reflection in the metal, her chestnut hair tied up neatly and her eyes still heavy from too little sleep. By the time she carried the breakfast tray toward the dining room, guards lined the walls as usual, though a few unfamiliar faces stood among them. It was not the first odd thing she noticed that morning. Enzo, the senior guard who had been here longer than any of them, gave her a small nod as she passed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair combed back and a scar along his jaw that hinted at a story he never told. He always treated the staff with quiet respect, something rare in a place where power lived in every corner. "Morning, Santina," he said in a soft voice. "Morning," she answered, grateful for the steady presence he carried. Farther down the hall, Paolo and Victor waited near the doorway, half watching the corridor and half whispering jokes to each other. They were loyal to Romeo, but their humor was crude and loud, often making the younger maids blush. Paolo winked at Santina as she passed, earning a sharp elbow from Victor. They straightened when they heard footsteps approaching. Romeo Barry's schedule never changed. 3 times a week he left the estate in the late morning for business across the city, each trip beginning with the same route and ending at the same hour. Staff timed their tasks around it. Santina could almost set her clock by the rumble of the car coming down the driveway. That consistency had always made her feel safe in a strange way. Routine meant predictability. Predictability meant survival. But in the days that followed the tense dinner, the estate's rhythm shifted. At first it was subtle. Different guards appeared at the doors of Romeo's office. One morning, when Santina delivered coffee, she found 2 men she had never seen before stationed outside the study. They wore the same black shirts as Romeo's usual security, but something about them felt wrong. Their eyes lingered too long, scanning her as if trying to measure whether she knew more than she should. Later that afternoon, Santina watched Amelia glide down the corridor in a deep green dress, her diamonds catching the light. The elegant wife moved with her usual grace, but she paused outside a meeting room where 2 men in sharp suits waited. Santina had never seen them before either. Amelia dismissed the hallway staff with a gentle smile, then slipped inside and closed the door behind her. The new driver, Marco, appeared more frequently as well. He moved through the estate with confidence that felt earned too quickly. One morning Santina found him speaking with a guard near the restricted wing. The guard looked uneasy, but Marco simply smiled as if he belonged there. When he turned away, his eyes darted down the hall toward Romeo's study. It was during a quiet afternoon, when the estate hummed with low conversation and distant footsteps, that Santina's unease sharpened into something colder. She was changing linens in Amelia's private sitting room, a space she entered only when summoned or assigned. The room smelled of rose water and polished wood. Soft light filtered through the curtains, casting thin shadows across the floor. As Santina shook out a fresh sheet, she noticed the wastebasket beside Amelia's writing desk. Crumpled paper peeked from the top. It was unusual. Amelia was precise and rarely left mess behind. Santina hesitated. Her instinct told her to ignore it, to leave the room untouched. But the tension of the past few days had sharpened her senses. Something about the discarded papers felt important. She closed the door quietly, ensuring no one watched her, then crouched beside the basket. Her fingers lifted the first torn scrap. It was thick, expensive stationery, the kind used for contracts or private letters. She found more pieces, ripped unevenly, as if Amelia had destroyed them in a hurry. Her heartbeat quickened. Curiosity battled with fear. She knew the rule that kept maids alive. She knew stories of what happened when people stepped too far into the shadows of this house. Yet she could not ignore the feeling that pulsed through her, the same chill that had crawled up her spine the night before. With trembling hands, Santina gathered the pieces and spread them across the vanity. Her breath fogged the mirror as she pieced the fragments together. Words emerged slowly. Times, dates, a road she recognized from Romeo's routine route. And scattered between them were phrases that made her blood turn cold. No witnesses after dinner. Accident on wet pavement. Curve after the first bend. She stared at the page, unable to move. The room seemed to shrink around her. The air turned heavy. She pressed her palms flat against the vanity to steady herself. Romeo Barry's was not simply being watched. Someone was planning to kill him. She gathered the pieces quickly, stuffing them back into the wastebasket exactly as she had found them. Her heart raced. She unlocked the door and stepped into the hall, trying to keep her steps even. But the words she had read clung to her thoughts, turning every shadow into a threat. That night, her duties took her back toward Amelia's wing of the estate. She carried a tray with tea, walking softly across the long corridor. The house was quieter after dark, the guards' footsteps echoing faintly from the floors below. Amelia's sitting room door was cracked open, spilling a thin line of warm light into the hallway. As Santina approached, a voice drifted through the opening. Amelia's voice, low, tight, and stripped of its usual elegance. "You'll make it look like the street took him." Santina froze. The tray in her hands trembled. A male voice responded, calm and measured. She could not make out the words, but his tone carried confidence. "After the next family dinner, it must be done," Amelia whispered. "I do not want delays." Santina pressed her back against the cold wall. She held her breath. She prayed they could not hear the pounding of her heart. There were no names, no threats spoken aloud, but the meaning was unmistakable. Amelia was involved. She was planning Romeo's death. Santina stayed there for several seconds, unable to move or blink. The walls felt closer than before. The estate, once a home of strict routines and quiet safety, now felt like a stage built over a drop she could not see the bottom of. When she finally forced herself to walk, her steps were small and careful. She returned to the servants' hallway, set down the tray, and gripped the counter to steady herself. Her breath came in shallow bursts. The phrases from the torn letter replayed in her mind. The sound of Amelia's voice echoed in her ears. And for the first time since she had stepped into this house, Santina felt something worse than fear. She felt certainty. The plan was real, and Romeo Bariz had no idea his perfect wife was sharpening the knife. For the next few days, Santina tried to convince herself that she had imagined everything. She told herself that rich people spoke in metaphors, that maybe Amelia's words had been about some business contract or a rival that had nothing to do with roads and accidents. She repeated those excuses in her head while she made beds and wiped mirrors, but they never settled. Sleep stopped helping. Every night, she drifted off only to see Romeo's car sliding across wet pavement, headlights swinging wildly before vanishing into black water. Sometimes she stood on the roadside in those dreams, unable to move while metal screamed and glass shattered. Sometimes she sat in the back seat herself and watched the driver's hands let go of the wheel. She always woke with her heart hammering, fingers clawed into the sheets. The mornings did not offer any comfort. The estate's routine pulled her along as it always had. She swept, dusted, polished. She ironed shirts that smelled faintly of gunpowder and cologne. She turned down sheets in empty guest rooms, imagining all the things that had been discussed in those beds. On the outside, she was as quiet and efficient as ever. On the inside, it felt like a clock was ticking louder and louder, counting down to a night no one else could hear. On the third day after she overheard the phone call, a letter arrived from home. The envelope bore her village's postmark and her mother's careful handwriting. Santina opened it in the small staff kitchen, hands already trembling, because letters from home rarely brought good news anymore. Her mother wrote that the coughing had grown worse, that the doctor wanted to change her medication, that the pharmacy refused to extend credit again. The last paragraph was full of apologies, as if needing help were some shameful luxury. Santina did not finish her tea. She folded the letter slowly and slipped it back into the envelope, pressing it to her chest for a moment. Then she went to the laundry room, dug under her mattress with a tin box where she kept her wages, and counted out everything she could spare without missing the housekeeper's expected contribution for uniforms and supplies. There was no fat to cut. If she lost this job, there would be nothing. Her father's voice rose in her memory as she packed the money into a new envelope. He had been a man of rough hands and tired eyes, who believed the world was not kind to people who drew attention to themselves. Before he died, he had warned her once when news spread that a local boy had been beaten for asking questions about a nearby crime family. "Keep your head low, Tina," he had said, resting a hand on her hair. "There are people whose business is blood and fear. We are not those people. We survived by staying out of their way. She had nodded, trusting him completely. She thought of another face now, one that belonged to her childhood friend Davide. He had been sharp-tongued and restless, always testing limits. When a small group of men started drinking at the bar on the village's edge, Davide made jokes about whose cars they drove and why they never stayed long. He laughed that someone should find out where their money came from. 2 weeks later, Davide was gone. The story was that he had left to find work in the city, but no one had seen him board a bus. No one had received a letter. His parents locked themselves in their house and avoided talking to neighbors. The message was clear without being spoken. Thinking about him now, Santina felt the old fear rise again. Speaking about powerful people, even by accident, had a cost. She had known that her entire life. So she tried to bury what she had heard from Amelia under all those warnings. She told herself that silence was the safest choice, not only for her, but for her mother. Yet the house itself seemed determined not to let her rest. Amelia, usually composed, grew more tightly wounded each day. She called for Santina more often, sometimes for tasks that did not really require her. She would sit at her vanity while Santina arranged jewelry boxes or folded scarves, and ask questions in a light tone that did not match the tension in her shoulders. "Has my husband been eating properly?" Amelia would say, studying her reflection. "Too much red meat is not good for his heart." Santina would answer that the kitchen followed Romeo's preferences, that he rarely left food on the plate. In his meetings, Amelia would continue, pretending to glance casually at the clock. "He still leaves on Tuesdays and Thursdays, yes? He is not changing his schedule suddenly?" The questions were always framed as concern, as if she were a worried wife tracking a beloved husband's health. But her eyes were too sharp. Her fingers tapped a rhythm on the dressing table whenever she asked about the exact times Romeo left the house and which car he took. The new driver, Marco, played his own part. Whenever Santina encountered him near the garages, he would try to pull her into easy conversation. "Long nights," he would say, leaning against the wall with practiced charm. "Does the signore often keep you serving until late? What time does dinner usually finish when there are guests?" He pretended to be calculating overtime, grumbling about extra hours. Santina answered in vague terms, shrugging and saying that every evening was different. Inside, her stomach knotted. Not everyone ignored the tension. One evening, as she carried clean glassware through a side corridor, Enzo stepped out from a doorway and walked beside her. His voice was low enough that no one else could hear. "There is something off in the orders," he murmured. Trips scheduled that the boss did not sign himself. Routes changed without him asking. "You have not seen anyone tampering with the papers near the office, have you?" Santina swallowed. "No, Enzo. I only cleaned the hall." He studied her for a moment, as if weighing the truth in her eyes. Then he gave a small nod. "Keep your head clear," he said. "And if you ever hear someone spreading stories about the signore, stay far from them. Rumors are dangerous here." His words should have been reassuring. Instead, they pinned her between two fears. If she spoke, she could be accused of spreading lies. If she stayed quiet, she would be silently complicit in whatever happened on that dark road. That night, she lay awake long after the other maids had drifted off, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. She replayed Enzo's warning, Amelia's questions, Marco's too casual curiosity. Her father's advice fought with Davide's disappearance in her head. There seemed to be no path that did not lead to danger. The days continued to slide by, each one tightening the knot in her chest. She began to notice more small changes. A guard she trusted was suddenly reassigned to an outer gate. Another, who had always been hot-tempered, now lingered near the garage, as if waiting for something he did not understand. Every shift seemed to bring a new sign that the house was quietly aligning itself around a decision Romeo had not made. Finally, the announcement came. The housekeeper gathered the staff in the main kitchen after lunch, wiping her hands on a towel as she spoke. "There will be a formal dinner this weekend," she said. "Important guests from the city and from neighboring territories. The signore wants everything perfect. New linens, extra silver, fresh flowers in the hall. He will leave afterward to sign an agreement. The driver has the route. The words landed in Santina's stomach like a stone thrown into deep water. Formal dinner. Guests. Departure afterward. A route already chosen. She did not need to see the torn letter again to remember its contents. The times and the stretch of road had burned themselves into her memory. The description in the note matched exactly what the housekeeper was saying now. Milano, the woman added, turning to her. You will serve at the head of the table. The signora likes your speed. Do not make me regret this. Santina nodded, but her throat had gone dry. All afternoon, she moved like a person in a dream. She set the table, aligning each piece of silver, smoothing each crease from the cloth, while her mind ran in frantic circles. She pictured Romeo leaving the estate that night, relaxed after a successful dinner, trusting the driver behind the wheel. She imagined Amelia standing at the upstairs window, watching the car's taillights vanish down the drive, waiting for a call that would say his body had been pulled from twisted metal. Every time she tried to push the image away, her mother's letter rose in its place. Without this job, there would be no medicine. Without Romeo, there might not be a job at all. The house would change hands, and the new owner might not keep the same staff. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the pantry counter to steady herself. The kitchen hummed with activity behind her, cooks shouting instructions and clattering pans. She stood slightly apart, breathing hard. If she stayed silent, and the plan succeeded, she would live with the knowledge that she had watched a man walk toward his death and said nothing. She had already seen enough of this world to understand that Romeo was not a saint, but he had given her work, security, a roof over her head. He had not hurt her. He had not hurt her mother. If she spoke and someone accused her of lying, she could be dismissed or worse. Her father's warnings whispered in one ear. Davide's vanished face stared from the other. Santina pressed her forehead lightly against the cool wall of the pantry and closed her eyes. See everything. Say nothing. The rule had protected her for years. It had kept her safe in a village ruled by shadows, and now in a house built on quiet power. But as she repeated it now, the words felt wrong. They felt like a chain she had clasped around her own throat. She thought of Romeo at the head of the table, of Amelia's voice on the phone, of Marco's questions about how late dinners ran. She thought of the curve in the road where the brakes would fail or the car would slide, of the way her nightmares always ended in silence. A slow, trembling breath left her. If she did nothing and Romeo died, she would never be able to look at herself again. No amount of money sent home would wash that guilt away. Santina opened her eyes and lifted her head. Her hand still shook, but something inside her had settled. The decision was small and enormous at the same time. For the first time in her life, she chose to break the rule that had kept her alive. She would speak. The memory of that decision followed Santina as the guard opened the heavy office door and motioned her inside. Her palms were damp against the fabric of her apron. She stepped over the threshold and into a part of the house she had only ever glimpsed from a distance. Romeo Barry's office felt like another world. The room was longer than she expected, the ceiling lower, the light dim and steady from shaded lamps. Dark shelves lined the walls, crowded with ledgers, heavy books, and thick folders whose labels meant nothing to her. Framed maps hung between them, some marked with small pins and faint pencil notes. On one wall, black and white photographs were arranged in a grid. Some showed ports, others captured men shaking hands, their faces serious and blurred slightly, as if they did not like being caught on camera. At the center of the room sat a large desk, its surface neat but dense. A lamp cast a pool of warm light over stacked documents and an open ledger. She noticed narrow seams in the wood that hinted at compartments hidden beneath. The air smelled faintly of paper, ink, and the ghost of cigar smoke. Romeo sat behind the desk, jacket unbuttoned, sleeves rolled to show the ink at his wrists. In this room, he seemed even more solid than at the head of the dining table, less like a distant figure and more like the fixed point around which everything else moved. His eyes were on her before the door closed behind her. "Santina Milano," he said quietly. "Come closer." Her feet obeyed even as her throat tightened. She walked until she stood on the rug in front of his desk, close enough to see the small lines at the corners of his eyes. The guard remained by the door, silent. For a long moment, Romeo said nothing. He simply studied her, gaze steady, weighing something behind his expression. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "Repeat what you told me at dinner," he said. "Every word." Santina swallowed. "I said that your wife had betrayed you, that you were the target tonight." His eyes did not flicker at the use of the word wife. If anything, his face grew more still. "And why," he asked, "would a maid choose to make such a claim about the woman who can have her dismissed with a single sentence?" Her fingers curled into her apron. "Because it is true, signore." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Then start at the beginning. You will tell me everything you saw and heard. If you leave anything out, I will know." The warning lay more in his gaze than in his tone. Santina drew a careful breath and began. She told him about the corridor outside Amelia's sitting room, the phone call half overheard, the phrases about the street taking him. She described the torn pieces of paper in the wastebasket, how she had pieced them together on the vanity and read the words about wet pavement and a curve in the road. She mentioned Marco's questions about dinner times, Amelia's sudden interest in his schedule, the way staff assignments had shifted around his trips. Romeo did not interrupt at first. His eyes stayed on her face, though sometimes his fingers moved slightly, tapping a pattern against the arm of his chair, as if comparing her story to something only he could see. When she finished, he lifted a sheet of paper from the desk and glanced at it. "Again," he said, "this time tell me the exact words you heard on the call." She repeated them as precisely as she could. He nodded once, slow, then reached for another document. "Marco asked about the length of dinners," he said. "On which days?" "The day before the letter," she answered. "And again 3 days after." He flipped through a small notebook, eyes scanning lines. For the first time since she had entered, he looked away from her for more than a heartbeat. The silence stretched. "You should understand something," he said finally, closing the notebook. "The driver was already under observation. Not by you, by me." Santina blinked. "You suspected him, signore?" "I suspect everyone," Romeo replied. "It is why I am still alive." There were gaps in his story when he came to us. Contacts that did not match the papers he carried. I set certain tests in place. Your words tonight confirmed that whatever game he played did not start and end at the gate. It reached inside this house. The word inside landed heavy between them. He reached into a drawer and placed a slim file on the desk, opening it to reveal several printed pages and a few small photographs. He turned one page toward her. It held a list of times and dates, with short notes in the margin. On the next page, she recognized the curved letters of Amelia's stationery. The torn letter had been reassembled more perfectly than Santina's hasty attempt at the vanity. "You are not the only one who has seen the scraps," Romeo said. "My people retrieved what you left in the basket. It seems you are curious, but careful." "Good." Another sheet showed a partial transcript of a phone call. One line made Santina's stomach twist. "After the dinner, the curve by the coastal road. No witnesses." The name attached to the call was not Amelia's. It was a code, but Romeo tapped the side of the page with one finger. "This came from her private line," he said. "We intercepted it 2 nights ago." Santina stared at the pages, the reality of what she had stumbled into pressing down on her fully for the first time. She had known, but seeing the words laid out in ink, knowing that someone had listened and recorded, made it feel less like a nightmare and more like a storm she was standing in the center of. He watched her reaction carefully. The only sign of his own anger was the way his jaw clenched for a brief moment, a tightening that vanished as quickly as it appeared. There was no shouting, no slammed fist on the desk. His rage lived in the spaces between his words, in the longer pauses before he spoke. "My wife," he said quietly, tasting the word like something bitter, "has been speaking to men who want what I have built. They requested routes, schedules, moments when I will be less guarded. She gave them enough." Santina's voice was barely audible. "Why, signore?" Romeo closed the file. "That is the question, is it not?" He let the silence stretch again, then folded his hands on the desk. When he next spoke, his tone shifted, gaining a weight that made the air feel heavier. "You took a risk tonight," he said. You could have kept your mouth shut. Watched me leave, counted your wages, sent them home. Many in your position would have done just that. Instead, you whispered a sentence that could have had you dragged from the room. She swallowed. I could not let it happen. Not if I knew. And yet, he said, tilting his head slightly, you waited until tonight to speak. Why not come sooner? Santina felt heat rise to her face. I was afraid. I thought I might be wrong, that I misheard. And my mother, she is ill. If I lose this work, she loses her medicine. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but when they set the dinner and the trip after, it matched the words in the letter. I could not stay silent then. He listened without comment. When she finished, he opened a different drawer and pulled out a simple, unmarked envelope. He weighed it in his hand before setting it on the desk between them. Here is what will happen next, he said. You have two paths, Santina. Her name in his mouth made her feel smaller and larger at the same time. In this envelope, he continued, is enough money and documentation to take you and your mother far from here. Another country, another name, work arranged with people who owe me favors. You would leave tomorrow. You would never speak of any of this again. Her eyes dropped to the envelope, to the edges of the paper that could erase the life she knew. Or, he said, you can stay. You can help me pull at the threads that begin with my wife and run through every hand that touched this plan. You would remain in this house, but not as just a maid. You would watch, listen, report, and understand that from the moment you choose this, enemies and allies will see you differently. Some will want you protected. Some will want you gone. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. If I take the envelope, she asked quietly, what happens to her? To Amelia? Romeo's gaze hardened. That is my concern, not yours. If you leave, you forget this place. You build a life on clean ground. If you stay, you stand in the mud with the rest of us, and you accept that it will never wash off completely. Images flashed in Santina's mind. Her mother, coughing as she tried to stir soup in the tiny kitchen back home. Amelia smiling at the table, diamonds catching the light, knowing that somewhere men waited for Romeo's car to hit a curve. Marco leaning against a wall, pretending concern about overtime while measuring how long dinners ran. She thought of the nightmares, of glass and twisted metal and silence. If I leave, she said slowly, and they succeed the next time, I will know that I walked away so I would not have to see it. You would be safe, Romeo replied. She met his gaze, surprised at the steadiness in her own voice. I would be a coward. For the first time, something almost like respect flickered in his eyes. You are a maid, he said. No one expects you to carry this. Except I already do, she answered. I saw enough to speak. If I run now, it follows me. I cannot pretend I did not know. Silence settled between them again, heavier this time, filled with the shape of her choice before she had quite spoken it aloud. Finally, she straightened her shoulders. I will stay, signore. I will help you. I do not know this world, but I know what I saw. I know how to listen. Romeo regarded her for a long moment, then pushed the envelope back into the drawer and closed it with a soft click. So be it, he said. You understand there is no path back to the life you had before tonight. Yes, she said. Her hand still shook, but her voice did not. He reached for the phone on his desk and pressed a button. Send Enzo in. A moment later, the door opened and Enzo stepped inside, glancing from Romeo to Santina with quiet curiosity. This one, Romeo said, nodding toward her, is under my protection now, and under your watch. She will continue her duties, but you will see to it that she has access where she needs it, and that anyone who takes too much interest in her is noted. Enzo's brows lifted slightly, but he gave a short nod. Understood. Romeo turned his attention back to Santina. You will speak only to me or to him about what you see and hear. No one else, not even if they claim to come on my behalf. Do you understand? Yes, signore. Then go, he said. Rest while you can. This house will not feel the same to you tomorrow. Enzo gestured toward the door. Santina turned and walked beside him into the corridor. The air outside the office felt different, as if she had stepped from a room of still water into a river already in motion. They moved in silence at first. The familiar corridor lights glowed softly on the stone. She could hear distant sound from the kitchens, the muted echo of guards changing positions. "You told him something important," Enzo said at last, not quite a question. She kept her eyes ahead. "I told him the truth. That is not always rewarded in this world," he replied. But it seems tonight it kept him breathing. They reached the point where the servants' hallway branched away from the main one. Enzo stopped and looked down at her. "From now on," he said, "you are still a maid to most of this house. Do your work. Keep your head low. But understand that some people will sense a change, even if they do not know why. Be careful who you stand near. And if something feels wrong, you find me." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle beside the weight of Romeo's. When she walked the rest of the way to the staff quarters alone, the estate did not feel like the place she had entered months ago with a shaking tray and a borrowed uniform. The same chandeliers hung above her. The same portraits watched from the walls. Yet every corridor now felt like part of a pattern she had only just begun to see. Her life was no longer just about polished silver and folded sheets. It was about surviving inside a war she had stepped into with a whisper. The change did not arrive with trumpets. It came the next morning, with Enzo waiting in the corridor outside the staff quarters, arms folded, expression unreadable. "Walk with me," he said. Santina followed him through a side passage that servants rarely used unless they were carrying tools. The air was cooler there. Stone walls rose close on either side, broken only by a few narrow windows that let in thin light. "You already notice more than most," Enzo said quietly. "That is why he listens to you now. But noticing is not enough. You must learn to hold information in your head, separate it from your fear." He led her to a small sitting room that rarely saw guests. The furniture was simple, a faded rug on the floor, a low table between two chairs. He gestured for her to sit. "We start with what you see every day," he said. "Time, faces, routes." For the next hour, he questioned her like a teacher with a difficult student. What time did Romeo usually leave his office in the evenings? Which guard had stood nearest the main door the previous night? How many times had Marco passed through the main hall before dinner last week? At first, her answers came slowly. She realized that although she had always paid attention, she had never tried to hold the details in order. They had been impressions, not records. Enzo showed her how to anchor them. "You build a line in your head," he said, tapping his temple. "Morning, noon, night. You place each moment on it. The more you practice, the easier it becomes." He had her close her eyes and walked through the previous day, step by step, from lighting the first kitchen lamps to laying the last napkin on the table. How many times had Amelia crossed the hall? Who stood outside Romeo's office at noon? Which cars had left the estate and which had returned? By the end of the exercise, Santina's head ached, but she could see the pattern of the day more clearly than she had ever seen it before. "Good," Enzo said. "You will do this every night before you sleep. You will build the day in your mind and look for pieces that do not fit." Her regular duties did not change on the surface. She still scrubbed steps, ironed shirts, and carried trays into rooms where she was meant to be invisible. The difference now was that every tray, every duster, every trip down a corridor served a second purpose. Wherever she went, she watched with new intent. A week later, Enzo pressed a small metal object into her hand in a quiet corner of the pantry. It was no larger than the tip of her thumb, with a tiny switch on one side. "It records," he said. "You do not touch it once it is placed. You let us collect it later." Her pulse picked up. "Where?" "In the rooms where we cannot stand without being noticed," he replied. "The sitting rooms, the small salons." Her rooms. The idea of stepping into Amelia's private space with more than linens and polish made Santina's stomach tighten, but she nodded. The first device she hid in a crystal vase that sat on a low table in Amelia's sitting room. She had been sent to change the flowers, and while her hands arranged the new stems, her fingers slid the device under a cluster of leaves where no one would see it. The second went behind a row of framed photographs in a smaller salon that Amelia liked to use for intimate meetings. Each placement made Santina feel as though she were slipping another stone in her pockets while walking through deep water. The pressure inside the house grew with each passing day. Romeo moved through his routines with the same outward calm, but in private moments Santina caught a hint of distance in him. He no longer lingered as long at Amelia's side during meals. Car rides that had once followed predictable routes now changed at the last minute. A driver would prepare one vehicle, only to be told that Romeo would leave by the back entrance in a different car. Meetings were postponed for reasons that were never explained, and some faces that had once been regular at the estate stopped appearing altogether. Amelia noticed. She did not speak of it openly, but Santina saw the way her jaw clenched when a messenger arrived to say Romeo would not be joining her for lunch after all, or when a car she expected to hear at a particular hour never returned. Her attitude towards Santina shifted as well. It began with small things. A ring that had been on the dressing table one moment was suddenly declared missing the next. Amelia would turn slowly, eyes narrowing, and say, "Santina, did you move my jewelry without asking?" "No, Signora," Santina would reply, heart pounding. Amelia would let the silence drag on before smiling slightly and finding the ring in another box. "How careless of me," she would say, though the look she gave Santina said she did not believe her own words. Another day, Amelia ran a finger along a flawlessly ironed dress and frowned. "There is a crease here," she said. "Do you not see it?" Santina saw nothing, but she apologized and took the dress back anyway. Soon it was constant. A glass not shining enough. A cushion not fluffed to Amelia's liking. She began to request other maids for personal tasks and hinted to the housekeeper that perhaps Santina was overworked. Yet whenever the question of who served in the main dining room came up, Romeo's message was clear. "Milano stays," he had told the housekeeper. "She knows my table." The result was a cold war no one named. In front of the staff, Amelia remained polite to Santina, but in private her gaze cut sharper than any words. Santina responded with lowered eyes and soft apologies while her ears strained for every phone call, every quiet visit behind closed doors. The recordings Enzo brought her to review were carefully selected. She never saw the full files, only the parts that touched on Amelia's dealings. They would sit in a small side room with a simple player on the table between them, listening to voices lowered in false comfort. One night, the line crackled and Amelia's voice came through clearly, stripped of its public softness. "You promised this would be clean," Amelia said. "No chaos, no blood in the streets. Just him, and the ones closest to him." A male voice replied, "There are always ripples. You know that. Your brother understood it too when he tried to cut into operations that were not his." The sound of glass set hard on a table followed. "My brother was desperate," Amelia said. "You should be thanking him. Without his mistake, you would not have learned how far Barry's reach was. He froze him out, left him to rot in a city that was not his. And now you want to tell me about ripples?" The voice on the other end chuckled softly. "We are giving you a path to make that history mean something. Once he is gone, you will have influence over a part of what he leaves. You can shape it, or you can stand alone in that house and pretend the walls are not closing in." The recording clicked off. Santina sat very still, the words settling over her like dust. She had wondered why Amelia would risk everything. Now the picture sharpened. In another meeting with Romeo, she heard the rest of the story. He spoke about it without flourish, as if reciting a weather report he would rather forget. Amelia's brother had tried to skim from one of Romeo's operations years before, playing both sides between rival groups for quick profit. Romeo had discovered it and chosen exile instead of immediate death. "I cut him off for my protection," Romeo said. "I warned him that if he kept moving in shadows, he would find someone with less patience than mine. Months later, he turned up dead in an alley in another country. Not by my hand, but my decision pushed him onto that street." He did not call it regret, but Santina saw the way his eyes hardened when he mentioned the alley. For Amelia, her brother's death had never been a consequence of her brother's choices. It had been a sentence she believed Romeo had signed. When a rival group approached her years later, all they had to do was press on that wound and promise that his end would finally mean something. Santina walked away from that conversation with her thoughts split in two. One part of her understood Romeo's cold logic. In his world, a man who stole from him was a crack in a wall that had to be sealed. Exile had been mercy by those standards. Another part of her saw Amelia alone at a funeral, knowing that the man who shared her blood had died far from home, cut off from the safety she believed her marriage should have provided. Her anger, however twisted, was not hollow. In quiet moments, cleaning a corridor or folding sheets, Santina felt that conflict press on her. Had she become the blade in Romeo's hand, aimed at a woman whose pain was real, even if her choices were poisonous? She voiced a little of this to Enzo one evening as they stood in a shadowed corner near the back steps, watching guards rotate under the cold stars. She lost her brother, Santina said. Even if he did wrong, the grief is still there. Sometimes I wonder if I am helping to bury her for feeling something that any sister would feel. Enzo considered her words. Grief explains many things, he said. It does not excuse planning the deaths of men who never touched her brother, or you, or the other staff. If the boss had gone over that cliff, do you think they would have left this house untouched? People like the one she speaks to do not care who stands in the way when they move in. He glanced at her. You mean the cooks, the old gardener. We would have been noise. Collateral, as they like to say. Do not forget that when you feel sorry for her. The reminder settled like a stone in her chest. The outside pressure grew harder to ignore. One afternoon, news reached the estate that one of Romeo's warehouses at the edge of the city had been hit. The story came through the guards in fragments. A sudden blaze in the night, trucks damaged, one man left bleeding on the pavement with a message pinned to his jacket. It was not written in full, only a symbol the inner circle recognized. The mark of the group Amelia had been feeding. Romeo responded quickly, sending men to secure other locations, redrawing routes, canceling deliveries. The house buzzed with quiet urgency. Schedules changed without warning. Some staff were told to stay inside the estate for several days, as if the walls themselves offered more safety than the streets. When Amelia heard about the attack, she went very still. Santina saw her in the corridor just after a whispered conversation between Romeo and Enzo. Her face had lost some of its color. For the first time, fear showed openly in her eyes. This was not what I agreed to, Santina overheard her say later through one of the hidden devices. Her voice trembled, anger and panic tangled together. They said it would be precise, clean. Now there are fires in the city. They have lost control. On the other end of the line, the man's response was sharp. You set this in motion. There is no turning back now. If he tightens his grip, we have to push harder. Amelia's answer was almost a whisper. You do not understand him. If he realizes how far this has gone, it will not just be your people he comes for. Listening in a small side room with Enzo, Santina closed her eyes briefly. Amelia had wanted one death, wrapped in the disguise of an accident. Instead, she had invited a storm that cared nothing for her limits. The more Santina saw, the less the world divided neatly into victim and villain. She stood between a man who ruled through fear and discipline and a woman whose love and hate had braided together into betrayal. Somewhere in that tangle, she had to decide where to place her own thin line of loyalty. And every step she took now, every word she overheard and carried back to Romeo, only pulled her deeper into a conflict that had started long before she ever set foot in this house. She was not the only one who felt the shift. Within days of the warehouse attack, the estate tightened in a different way. It was not just the guards who grew more alert. Amelia's eyes sharpened too. She moved through the corridors like someone who had woken to find a draft in a room that should have been sealed. Somewhere, someone was letting the cold in. The testing began quietly. One afternoon, Santina watched from the far end of the hall as Amelia stopped a young kitchen worker outside her sitting room. The girl had been delivering a tray of tea, nothing unusual. Yet Amelia stepped into her path, smiled gentle, questions sharper than glass. Do you often walk past this door? Amelia asked. Do you ever hear my calls, child? Do you listen when you should not? The girl stammered that she would never eavesdrop. Her hands shook, clattering the cups on the tray. Later that evening, Santina learned that the kitchen worker had been dismissed and sent away without notice. The reason given was clumsy work, but everyone understood that the real reason was proximity to the phone line. The message slid through the staff like smoke. Someone was leaking information. Until the leak was found, no one was safe. Amelia's gaze began to linger on people's faces a beat too long. She summoned staff to her rooms one by one for small tasks that could have been done by others, then turned idle conversation into quiet interrogation. It was only a matter of time before she tried to corner Santina. It happened one late morning in the private sitting room. Santina had been dusting the shelves, moving carefully so as not to disturb the hidden device near the framed photographs. Amelia sat at the window, a book open on her lap, eyes not really focused on the page. "Santina," she said suddenly. "Come here." Santina set the duster aside and approached. "You have been here almost 2 years, have you not?" Amelia asked. "Yes, Signora." Amelia studied her face with a softness that felt rehearsed. "You are very loyal. The housekeeper says you work hard, that you do not gossip. That is rare in a place like this." "Thank you, Signora. You send money home," Amelia continued. "To your mother. I asked the accounts office. They told me that every month a portion of your wages goes to a little village with a name no one here can pronounce." The back of Santina's neck prickled. "She is ill, Signora." "I know," Amelia said. "I know what it is to worry about family." She reached for a small velvet box on the table beside her and opened it, revealing a delicate gold bracelet glittering with tiny stones. "I can help you," she said. "A better doctor, better medicine. You should not have to work yourself into the ground just to keep her breathing." Santina's fingers tightened together in front of her. "I'm grateful for my work here, Signora." "I'm not talking about work," Amelia replied, voice dropping lower. "I'm talking about protection. Sometimes people in this house see things that trouble them. They hear things. They feel unsafe. If you ever found yourself in that position, you could come to me. Tell me what worries you, what frightens you about my husband. I would make sure you and your mother are looked after." The trap lay plain between them. It was not what Amelia said, but what she was asking without naming it. Santina let her shoulders hunch slightly, allowing a small tremor into her voice. "The only thing that frightens me is anger, Signora. The guards when they drink. The way they shout at each other. Sometimes I worry they will bring trouble to the house." It was not entirely a lie. She had learned to survive on careful half-truths. "Nothing about Romeo?" Amelia pressed. "No late meetings that seem strange to you? No sudden changes that make you think he is hiding something from us?" She kept her eyes on the carpet. "The Signore is far above my head. I only see orders passed down. I try not to look too closely. My father always said that noticing powerful men is a quick way to lose sleep." Amelia watched her for several long seconds, the bracelet glinting between her fingers. Finally, she closed the box and set it aside. "You are wise then," she said. "For your own sake, keep it that way." Her tone was light, but the suspicion had not left her eyes. While Amelia probed the staff, Romeo was drawing his own lines. In the office with the low lamps and pin maps, he and Enzo spread out everything they had collected. Names of rival leaders linked with arrows to shell companies and warehouses. Bank transfers that connected accounts in other countries to thin fronts in the city. Printed transcripts of Amelia's calls, her voice speaking with chilling clarity about times, routes, and guarantees. "This is enough to cripple them," Enzo said one night, tapping a section of the board. "Hit these accounts, these docs, and they will bleed." "It is not enough to heal the wound inside my walls," Romeo replied. "I cannot leave it open. My people have to see where this began." His eyes moved over the papers, then settled on a blank space in the center of the board. "It ends here," he said. "In my house." The plan that followed was simple in its shape and complex in its details. He would host a dinner, not like the crowded show of power that had nearly killed him, but a smaller one. No outsiders, only Amelia, a handful of inner circle guards, and the maid who had whispered the truth the first time. The setting would mirror the night of the failed ambush. The same long table, the same candles, the same placement of chairs. "It is time they all see the mask fall," Romeo said. We called Santina to the office and laid it out. Her mouth went dry. "During this dinner," he told her, "you will repeat what you said to me on the night they waited for my car. She stared at him. In front of her, and every man who holds my life in his hands when he walks into the street with my name on his lips, Romeo answered. They will hear it from the one who saw what others missed. There will be no doubt about how the knife reached my back. Her heart thudded painfully. If I say those words where she can see my face, there is no hiding after that. She will hate me. She already suspects you, he said. She has been testing you, testing the staff. That game is finished. After that night, there will be no half measures. She knew he was right. Knowing did not steady her. The world outside the estate did not sit still while Romeo arranged his endgame. Other players moved. One morning, after a shift that had left her aching and foggy, Santina returned to her narrow room and found an envelope lying on her pillow. There was no name written on it, no sign of who had placed it there. Her first instinct was to fetch Enzo. Her second was to burn it without reading. Instead, she forced her fingers to open the flap. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short message printed in neat letters. We know about your mother. We know about the village. If you want her safe and your own future secure, help us finish what was started. You're close to him now. Tell him the wrong enemy. Tell him to look at the wrong docs, the wrong names. We will know if you do it. You will be rewarded. There was no signature. At the bottom, a symbol had been drawn, the same mark Enzo had described from the warehouse attack. The room seemed to tilt. For a moment, she could not feel her hands. This was not a distant war anymore. It had reached into the small space where she slept, into the village where her mother coughed and wrapped scarves around thin shoulders. They had eyes everywhere. The old fear tried to rise again, whispering that she was a fool for ever opening her mouth, that she should have taken Romeo's envelope and run. But that door was closed now. Even if she wanted to betray him, she had no idea how to play the kind of game these men played. No idea how to twist the information without being caught by someone on one side or the other. The note did not offer protection. It offered a slower death. She folded the paper with steady, deliberate movements and walked straight to Romeo's office. Enzo met her at the door, saw her face, and stepped aside without a word. Romeo read the note once, then again, then set it on the desk without visible surprise. They reached farther than I hoped they could, he said quietly. But perhaps not farther than I expected. They know about my mother, Santina said. They could hurt her. In this business, he replied, threats to family are the oldest trick. That is why I sent men to your village the day after you first walked into this room. She stared at him. You what? He opened a drawer and pulled out a single page. It was a telegram, brief lines of type reporting that an older woman from her village had been moved to a clinic in a nearby town, all expenses covered. Guards had been placed discreetly under the guise of clinic security. Your mother is there now, Romeo said. She arrived yesterday. She is under my protection. If these men try to touch her, they will find they have walked into the wrong door. Relief and dread crashed together in her chest. Her mother was safer, but the price of that safety was written everywhere in this room. You told me everything, Romeo said. You brought this note to me instead of hiding it. That is the proof I needed. You understand there is no middle ground for you anymore. Understand, she said, voice steady. When she left the office, her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The corridors she knew so well seemed sharper somehow, every corner holding both shelter and threat. The date for the private dinner was set. Word passed through the house in a strange hush. There would be a gathering soon, but not the kind that brought in men from the city with heavy coats and broad smiles. This would be a family affair, as the housekeeper put it. Only those who truly belonged would attend. On the afternoon before the chosen night, Santina found herself alone in the grand dining room. The table was bare, stripped of cloth and glass. Just dark polish wood stretching from one end of the room to the other. Dust motes turned lazily in the slanting light from the high windows. She walked to the head of the table and stopped where Romeo always sat. The room was quiet, only the distant wash of the sea reaching her ears. She drew in a breath and whispered into the empty air, testing the weight of the words that had already changed her life once. Your King wife betrayed you. You were the target tonight. Her voice sounded small in the wide room, but the echo that came back carried something larger. Memory. Consequence. She closed her eyes and pictured Amelia's face when she would hear those words spoken out loud in front of guards and husband, with no space left for pretense. She saw the mask dropping, one by one. Fear tightened her chest, but beneath it lay something else. A thin, fierce thread of resolve. She opened her eyes, rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair at the head of the table, and stood there for a long moment, steadying herself for the night that would seal all of their fates. That night came sooner than her nerves were ready for. When the appointed evening arrived, the grand dining room looked almost identical to the night of the failed ambush. Candles burned in tall holders along the length of the long, dark table. White cloth lay smooth and perfectly centered. Crystal glasses waited in precise rows. The polished surface reflected the soft light so clearly that Santina could see her own faint shape when she passed. The difference was in the emptiness. No guests from the city tonight. No extra chairs for visiting allies. Only one setting at the head for Romeo, one at his right for Amelia, and a smaller place prepared a little distance away, as if for a servant called closer than usual. Romeo sat where he always did, shoulders relaxed, a sheet of paper held in one hand. To anyone who did not know him, he might have seemed almost casual. Maroon shirt open at the collar, gold chain resting against his skin, tattoos like dark vines at his wrists. His eyes on the document were calm, but there was a weight in the room that did not match the stillness of his posture. Santina stood slightly behind and to the side, close enough to see the print on the page if she let her gaze drop. She kept her hands steady on the tray she carried. Her heart beat hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Amelia stood near Romeo's chair in a gown the same deep red she had worn on the night of the planned accident. Diamonds gleamed at her throat and ears, catching the candlelight in sharp flashes. Her hair was pinned in an elegant twist, not a strand out of place. On the surface, she looked as composed as ever, the perfect wife by her powerful husband's side. Only her hands betrayed her. One kept returning to her necklace, fingers pressing briefly against the stones as if they were a string of prayer beads. For guards lined the walls, all men from Romeo's inner circle. Enzo, Paolo, Victor, and another older guard named Luca. No one else. They stood straight, arms folded, eyes trained on the room. They were not here to impress guests tonight. They were here to witness something and, if needed, to finish it. Santina moved quietly, placing a basket of fresh bread on the table, adjusting a candle that burned a little lower than the rest. Every movement she made felt magnified, as if the air itself were watching. When the last item was in place, Romeo set down the paper and looked up, his expression easy. "Sit, Amelia," he said. "No need to hover. It is only supper." She laughed softly and took her seat, smoothing her gown under the table. "You say that as if you do not keep accounts even while you eat," she replied. "I saw the papers in your hand." "Just figures," he said. "Nothing that cannot wait for an hour." The tone between them sounded almost normal. He asked about her day. She mentioned a new painter she wanted to commission for the hall, a piece that would bring more light to the gloomy corner near the stairs. For a few minutes, it could have been any other private meal, but her fingers never stopped seeking the necklace. Santina poured wine in silence, set plates of food before them, then stepped back. She thought Romeo might ask her to leave, to let them eat alone as husband and wife. Instead, he glanced toward the third place, setting, and then at her. "Stay nearby," he said. "I may need you." Amelia's eyes flickered with surprise. Staff did not sit at this table. Staff did not have places at all. Yet Romeo's tone left no room for objection. When they had tasted the first course, Romeo reached down beside his chair and lifted a thick folder. He placed it on the table with deliberate care, its edges catching the light. "Before we go further," he said, "there are things in this house that need light more than any painting." Amelia's smile tightened. "What is this?" He did not answer her immediately. Instead, he looked towards Santina. "Come here," he said. "Stand by my side." She stepped forward, pulse pounding, until she was close enough to feel the warmth from the candles and smell the faint spice of the food. She caught a glimpse of Amelia's face as she moved. There was confusion there, and something like alarm. "Why is she here?" Amelia asked, the softness fading from her voice. "If you wish to discuss business, send the staff away." Romeo ignored the protest. His gaze shifted to the guards. "Luca," he said quietly, "lock the doors." The older guard moved without hesitation. The soft click of the door bolts sliding into place sounded louder than any shout. The room changed with that sound. It was no longer a dining room. It was a chamber where verdicts were given. Romeo rested his forearms on the table and looked at Santina. "On the night of the last dinner, before I was scheduled to leave, you came to my side and spoke very quietly," he said. "Tell everyone here what you told me." The air seemed to thicken around her. She could feel the weight of 4 pairs of guard eyes on her back and Amelia's stare like a blade on her face. Her mouth was dry, but her voice, when it came, held steady. "I told you," Santina said, "that your King wife betrayed you, that you were the target." The words fell heavy, then spread, filling the wide room. For a heartbeat, Amelia did not move. Her lips parted slightly, as if the sentence had knocked the air out of her. Then she laughed, a sharp sound with no warmth. "You see what happens when you let servants stand too close," she said, turning to Romeo. "She has filled her head with fantasies. She wants attention, perhaps a position, perhaps more. Do you really bring me here to listen to lies from a girl who polishes your silver?" Santina kept her gaze on Romeo's shoulder. The urge to shrink back was strong, but she held her ground. Romeo did not look at his wife yet. He opened the folder instead. "No," he said quietly. "I bring you here to listen to yourself." He lifted the first sheet and slid it closer to Amelia. Printed text covered the page, neat columns of letters and numbers. At the top was a date, then a note, "Call from primary line, sitting room." Romeo began to read. The words were familiar to Santina. She had heard them in the side room with Enzo, Amelia's voice stripped of pretense. After the dinner, the curb by the coastal road. "No witnesses," he quoted. "That is you, Amelia, speaking to a man whose name you never used, but whose accounts connect to these." He laid another paper beside the first. Bank records showing transfers from a quiet account under a false name in a companies connected to the rival group. "That is money moving from an account you control," he continued, "to men who burned my warehouse last week and left my guard bleeding on the ground." Amelia's knuckles whitened around her fork. "You could have forged this," she said, but the confidence was fading from her tone. "You could have made anything with a recorder and some imagination. You know how these games work. You taught me." Enzo stepped forward then, a small device in his hand. "We pulled the recordings from a line that should have been secure," he said. "Your line, Signora. The wires were traced. The origin is not in question." He placed photographs on the table as well. In one, Amelia sat at a cafe in the city, her face tilted toward a man in an expensive coat whose features were blurred as if he disliked being seen. In another, she stood outside a gallery, shaking hands with a different man later identified as a financial front for the rival group. Romeo turned to the final document, the reconstructed letter that had once been torn and thrown into a wastebasket. Times, places, the exact stretch of road where Santina had imagined twisted metal and broken glass. "You planned the accident," Romeo said. "You spoke to the men who would carry it out. You gave them my route, my habits, even the time I usually leave the table after these meals." The mask on Amelia's face cracked then, not in a full collapse, but in small fractures around the eyes and mouth. The polite wife expression slipped away, leaving something far sharper underneath. "You gave me no choice," she said, voice low. Romeo's brows lifted slightly. "No choice," he repeated. "You cut my brother off and pretended your hands were clean," she said. "You banished him from your protection and watched him die in a gutter in another country. You told yourself it was not your doing because no one could prove you gave the order. But you built the road that led there. Do not talk to me about accidents, Romeo. You have been arranging them your entire life." Her words came faster now, years of bitterness breaking through the surface. "You married me into this house of fear and rules and expected me to play the dutiful ornament while you decided who lived and who disappeared," she went on. You made yourself judge and executioner, and you think you are the only one allowed to hold a knife. She looked at Santina then, eyes burning. And you, little saint, do not look at me as if I am a monster you could never become. You serve his table. You wash the shirts he wears when he orders another man erased. You live under his roof and send his money to your mother. You are not clean either. The truth of that stung, but Santina stayed silent. Amelia drew a breath, shoulders lifting, then continued. When they came to me, she said, they did not speak of greed. They spoke of balance, of taking away the man who had taken everything and leaving a slice for me to control. A chance to make my brother's death mean something more than another tally mark in your ledger. I never asked them to touch the staff. I told them to keep it precise. You and your closest men, no one else. Her voice wavered for the first time. Then the fire started, she said. The warehouse, the messages. I saw what they really were, and I tried to pull back. But by then the wire around my neck was too tight. Silence settled heavy over the table. Romeo's face was unreadable. The guard stood tense, but still, waiting for the slightest motion of his hand. The choice before him was simple in shape and terrible in weight. If he gave a single nod, Amelia would be taken from the room and never seen again. The message to the city would be clear. Betrayal inside his own walls ended only in death. If he spared her, some would call it weakness. Others would call it madness. He did not react immediately. Instead, he let the quiet stretch, then turned his head to look at Santina. You heard everything she said, he said. You have seen what she has done, and you carry the weight of what she has lost. In this house, your words once pulled me away from a bullet. Tonight, they will not be ignored either. What do you believe should happen? Every gaze in the room shifted to her. Her legs felt like they might give way, but she stayed upright. She saw Amelia's anger, Romeo's control, Enzo's steady focus, the guarded curiosity on Paolo's and Victor's faces. She thought of the road where Romeo should have died, of the men in the warehouse, of her mother in a clinic far from the reach of these games. She thought of Amelia's brother in an alley, of the grief that had calcified into revenge. When I first came here, Santina said slowly, I believed there were clear lines between good and evil. I do not believe that anymore. I believe there are choices, and there are consequences, and there are people who must live with both. She turned slightly toward Amelia. Your pain is real, she said. If my brother had died far from home, I would have blamed anyone I could. But the plan you agreed to would not have killed only him. It would have killed Romeo and the men who guard him, men with families of their own. It would have thrown this house into chaos. The people who cook, who clean, who stand at the gates, they would have been the first to pay the price. Amelia's eyes shone, but whether from fury or unshed tears, Santina could not tell. You wanted one death to balance another, Santina continued. Instead, you offered yourself to men who were happy to burn everything. You lit a fire you could not control. She shifted her gaze back to Romeo. If you kill her now, she said, the city will understand that betrayal is answered with blood. That is what they already expect of you. It will change nothing except add another corpse to the count. She drew a breath. If you send her away, strip her of her role and her money, cut every thread she has to your affairs, you do something she will hate more than death. You remove her from the stage she wanted to stand on. You keep your empire intact without giving the rivals the excuse of a grieving widower to rally around. Publicly, you can say she is exhausted, unwell, that she needs rest in another house. Privately, you never let her near a phone or a visitor they do not choose. Santina's voice did not rise, but each word felt like a stone placed carefully in a wall. For a woman who craved power and position, she said, being alive and locked away is a sharper punishment than anything else. And it means no more blood stains this floor tonight. Silence followed, longer than before. Romeo's face gave nothing away. Amelia's breath came quick and shallow. The guards did not move. Finally, Romeo sat back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. You would have me exile my own wife, he said. Yes, Santina replied. You exiled her brother for breaking your rules. She broke more than his. Let her live with that, away from here. He studied her for a long moment, then turned his gaze to Amelia. Whatever softness had once existed between them was buried deep. "You wanted my death to mean something," he said to his wife. "Instead, your choice has shown me how far my reach must extend to keep this house standing. You're finished here, Amelia." Her face went pale. "So that is it?" she whispered. "You send me away like a servant who stole a bottle of wine." "I send you away like a woman who opened the door to enemies and expected them to stop where she told them to," he answered. "You will leave tonight. You will be taken to a villa far from this coast. You will have food, clothes, a bed. You will have no access to money, no phone I do not control, no visitors I do not approve. The world will be told that my wife is unwell and needs quiet. It will even be true." He looked to Enzo. "Make the arrangements," he said. "Use the plan we discussed." Enzo nodded once and signaled to Luca and Paolo. They stepped forward. For a moment, Santina thought Amelia would fight, clawing at the table, screaming. Instead, she lifted her chin, the last of her pride holding her spine straight. She turned her eyes on Santina one final time. There was hatred there, but also something like bitter recognition. "Remember this," Amelia said. "You are his voice today. Tomorrow you may be his shield. One day you might be his knife. There is no clean place beside a man like him." Then she let the guards lead her away. The doors opened, then closed again with a soft, final click. The room felt enormous and oddly empty. Romeo sat for a long moment, staring at the space where Amelia's plate still sat untouched. Then he exhaled once, a slow breath that seemed to carry years in it, and rose to his feet. The guard straightened, waiting. "We are finished for tonight," he said. "You know what to do with the information we have gathered. The men she spoke to will find their doors closed before they can reach for their weapons." Enzo stepped forward, gave a short, formal nod, and left with the others to carry out the orders already planned. That left Romeo and Santina alone in the candlelit room, the table between them like a line drawn in quiet light. He looked at her, really looked, as if seeing not just the maid who had once carried his wine, but the woman who had just shaped the fate of his marriage and his house with a few careful sentences. "Your whisper pulled me away from a bullet," he said. "Tonight your words kept this floor from running red. Do you understand the power you held in that moment?" Santina felt its weight settle over her shoulders, heavy and invisible. "I only said what I believed was right," she answered softly. He gave a small, unreadable smile. "In this world, that is rarer than you think." The candles burned lower, throwing long shadows up the walls. The guards outside the doors moved into new positions, the house already adjusting to the absence of its lady. Somewhere beyond the estate, men who had once counted on a wife's betrayal to cut a king down now found themselves hunted without their insider. In the quiet that followed, Santina understood that nothing about her life would ever be simple again. Her voice had helped decide who stayed, who left, and who would soon fall. And as she stood there in the glow of the last candles, she felt that truth settle into her bones like the sea wind in winter, a chill and a certainty she knew would never quite leave her. Weeks passed, and the house rearranged itself around the absence no one spoke about. Amelia's name slipped out of daily use, first from the guards, then from the staff. Her clothes vanished from the dressing room, her perfumes from the marble sink. The portrait that had once hung in the upstairs hall was quietly taken down one afternoon while most of the servants were busy downstairs. Santina passed the empty space later and felt the gap like a missing tooth, small but impossible not to notice. Romeo's empire shifted too. The changes did not come with dramatic announcements. They arrived as subtle absences. Men who had once sat close to Romeo at meetings stopped being invited. A bookkeeper who had delayed too many reports was reassigned to a distant warehouse, a move everyone understood was not a promotion. A cousin who had vouched for the rival group's reliability left for the countryside and did not return. In the city, the rival organization that had hunted Romeo lost ground. News filtered back to the estate in quiet fragments. A dock supervisor who owed allegiance to them was arrested before dawn on charges no one fully explained. 2 of their smaller warehouses burned in the night. Shipments went missing in transit, only to reappear later under Romeo's control. They did not vanish completely. Men like that rarely did. They retreated, regrouping in corners of the map beyond Romeo's immediate reach, nursing grudges for another day. For now, that was enough. Inside the estate, the air changed. Security tightened, but something else eased. Romeo introduced rules that were written down for the first time and pinned to the staff board in the kitchen. Rewards for good service were clearer. So were the punishments. There were still lines that could not be crossed, still consequences for betrayal, but careless cruelty became less common. Guards who struck staff for sport found themselves reassigned to posts far from the main house, or spoken to directly by Enzo in a tone that left no room for argument. Santina's place in this new order settled slowly, like sediment in clear water. Officially, the housekeeper announced that she had been given extra responsibility. She would now coordinate the schedules of the maids, manage supplies, and ensure that Romeo's private quarters and study were always prepared. Unofficially, everyone understood that she was closer to the center than any servant had been before. She began each morning in an office off the main kitchen, a small room that smelled of paper and coffee. There she reviewed lists of deliveries, staff rotations, and appointments. From there, she moved through the day, stepping in and out of rooms where conversations shifted as soon as she entered. At meetings in the estate's smaller salons, she sometimes stood near the wall, dressed not in her simple uniform, but in a dark skirt and blouse that could pass in both servant corridors and quiet conferences. She poured coffee for men who had once ignored her and now watched their words when she was in the room. She carried notes from Romeo to Enzo and back, and she listened, always. On other days, she still chose the black uniform and white apron, tying it around her waist with careful fingers. The cloth grounded her, reminded her of the girl who had first walked through these doors with shaking hands and a secondhand suitcase. It kept her from forgetting how quickly the floor beneath her could shift again. Romeo kept his promise about her mother. A month after the confrontation dinner, Santina traveled back across the water for the first time since she had left her village. The journey blurred in her memory later, a chain of cars and trains, and a short boat crossing, all arranged by men who spoke into phones and stepped aside when she passed. The clinic where her mother stayed was quiet and clean. The walls were painted soft colors. The nurses greeted Santina with polite familiarity. They had been told who was paying the bills. Her mother looked smaller in the bed than she had in the cramped house back home, but her breathing was easier. The cough that had once bent her double had softened into something manageable. Medicines lined a small shelf by the bed, bottles with labels Santina could not pronounce. "It is like a hotel," her mother said, though Santina knew her mother had never seen a hotel. "They bring food on trays. They take my temperature every morning. They say my lungs are stronger." Santina sat by the window with her, watching the light move across the fields beyond the clinic. Gratitude tugged at her. So did something heavier. She knew where the money came from that paid for the soft sheets and the steady heartbeat on the monitor by the bed. It came from docks and warehouses and deals made in dim rooms, from men who disappeared when they crossed the wrong person, from a house on a hill where decisions were measured in lives. When her mother thanked the kind patron who had arranged all this, Santina smiled and said only that there were people in the world who owed them a debt. On the journey back to the estate, she pressed her forehead against the cool window of the car and let the blur of passing lights wash over her. She did not know how to live with the fact that good care came from dark places. She only knew that her mother was breathing, and that without Romeo's intervention, she might not be. One evening not long after her return, Romeo sent word that he wanted dinner in the grand dining room. For two. Santina helped set the table herself, laying out only 2 places at one end of the long surface. No extra chairs, no rows of glasses, no guards at the walls, though she knew they waited just beyond the doors. When Romeo entered, he wore his usual black suit and maroon shirt, the top buttons open, the gold chain glinting at his throat. He sat at the head of the table and gestured for her to sit at his right. She hesitated, then took the seat. The last time she had been this close during a meal, Amelia had stood in red beside them, diamonds catching the light. The memory pressed against the edges of her mind, then receded. They ate in relative silence at first. The sound of cutlery on china and the distant wash of the sea filled the room. The candles burned lower as the courses passed. It was Romeo who broke the quiet. "You saw your mother," he said, more statement than question. "Yes," Santina replied. "She is better. They take good care of her." He nodded once. "Good." For a moment, it seemed that was all he had called her here to discuss. Then he set his fork down and leaned back, studying the candles as if searching for the right words in their flames. "There are men," he said slowly, "who believe that what we do is simple. You are loyal, you are rewarded. You betray, you die. Clean lines. No doubt. No regret." He paused, then looked at her. "I used to tell myself I was one of those men." "You are not," she asked quietly. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "If I were, Amelia would be in the ground, not in a house with locked doors and barred windows." Silence stretched, heavier than before. "Sending her away," he continued, "was not weakness. I know the city will say it is. Some of my own men think it. They like stories with sharp endings. But I have enough ghosts as it is. I have ordered things I do not speak of in this room. Killing her would have crossed a line in me that I do not wish to step over. Not yet." He glanced at her. "Your words reminded me that there are other ways to hold power besides making the floor run red. You kept my hand from one more stain I would never wash off." Santina thought of Amelia's final look, the mixture of hatred and truth in her eyes. She was still guilty, she said. "Exile does not erase what she did." "No," Romeo agreed. "But it keeps me from adding to my own list of sins when another path exists. I will not pretend that makes me a good man. It only makes me a man who is not finished deciding what kind of monster he is willing to become." They sat with that for a while. The wind rattled faintly at the windows, same as it had on the first night Santina had stood in this room with a tray and aching feet. "You carry ghosts too?" he said after a moment. "You still see that road in your sleep, do you not? The one where they waited for my car." "Sometimes," she admitted. "I see what would have happened if I had stayed silent. I see what might have happened if I had spoken sooner. There is no version where everyone is safe." "No," he said. "There rarely is." The honesty between them settled like another kind of contract. Not written, not sealed with signatures, but no less binding. Later, when the plates had been cleared and the candles had burned lower, Romeo returned to his usual place in the story. He moved to the head of the table, a stack of documents in front of him, the light from the chandelier turning the ink on the pages into dark lines on warm paper. Santina stood beside him, not behind him, reading over lists of shipments, schedules, and meetings. She pointed out small inconsistencies, suggested different times for certain routes, listened as he explained which names could be trusted and which could not. The guards at the edge of the room watched her now with a quiet respect. They no longer looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. Outside, the sea wind clawed at the cliffs, just as it had on that first harsh night. Inside, the light was golden, catching on glass and polished wood. The echoes of past dinners seemed to hover in the corners, but they no longer defined the room. Santina thought back to the moment when this all began, to a younger version of herself with a tray in her hands and a rule burning in her head. See everything, say nothing. She had broken that rule with one sentence. Your King wife betrayed you. You are the target. That single choice had turned her from an invisible maid into a woman whose voice shifted the path of an empire. It had protected a mother in a distant clinic and condemned a wife to a gilded prison. It had kept a man alive who ruled through fear and iron, and it had given that same man a chance, however small, to choose a different kind of strength. As she stood beside Romeo, going over the quiet details that kept his world turning, Santina understood something she could never have known back in her village. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is open their mouth after a lifetime of silence. It risks work, safety, and the fragile lives that depend on both. But if no one ever speaks, the same betrayals keep repeating, hidden behind pretty faces and polished silver, and the same roads keep leading to the same dark curves in the night.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.